Hey everyone, in this video, we're going to talk about phpMyAdmin. So this video is going to be primarily intended for my on-campus Intro to Databases class, but I'm also going to cross-post this to my public YouTube channel. So if you're a random person on the internet and you found this, welcome. I hope you also find this content interesting. So for this next upcoming assignment, I'm going to ask you to create a basic database within phpMyAdmin. So I want to give you a little bit of primer of how that process actually works. So phpMyAdmin is a tool that is open source and it's used for a lot of different purposes. It's primarily a graphical tool used by lightweight database administrators to manage websites that might be running WordPress or other common web applications. This tool, while it's commonly built into cPanel, can also be installed kind of on its own on a Linux server. But at least in our class, you're going to be primarily using it through cPanel. So cPanel, if you don't know what it is a control panel that is used for a lot of our web design classes here at my institution. But you also might encounter this too if you buy a shared web hosting for yourself, either to do like a portfolio or a small project, or if you're running a website for a small business, and oftentimes you might be using cPanel as well. It's very common for small to mid-sized websites that are hosted in a shared web hosting environment. So in our class, we're going to access cPanel through udemyamsoas.com/cPanel. This is how you're going to log into our LAMP server. Now, again, you first need to make sure you have an account registered on the server before you try to log in. I already have an account, so I'm going to go ahead and sign right in. Okay. Now, when you log in here, you might see some things that are slightly different. And your web host or whoever is providing the service can choose how this is themed and what icons you see or don't see. Ours is pretty generic. It just says cPanel at the top. If you were to buy a shared web hosting from like 1&1 or Bluehost or another shared web hosting provider, they may choose to theme this or to hide or show more of these icons. So cPanel is used for a lot of purposes. As an example, let's say you're running a website and you want to take a backup. There's a really cool area in here that you can run backups from. Or if you want to look at analytics, you can go in here and find some analytics. Do I have analytics even turned on? I don't. But there's oftentimes an analytics section in here. Yeah, it's called metrics now. So you can find that in here to find out like who's visiting your website and how many hits you're getting. And then most importantly for my class is going to be this databases section. So we have phpMyAdmin, which is what we're going to primarily be using, but you'll also notice there's some other things here as well. There's MySQL databases, MySQL database wizard, remote SQL. So what are these things? These things are going to be how essentially you're going to create databases on your account. If you jump straight into phpMyAdmin, you're going to notice that there's not really an area in here, at least within cPanel, to create a new database. So that's where you first need to go into the main cPanel page and make a database before you try to administer it. So to do that, you have two options. You can either use MySQL database or the wizard. The wizard works fine, but I tend to want to use the non-wizard version so that way I can understand each step of how this actually is going to work. I think as an IT person, it's really good to understand processes. And if you use a wizard, a lot of times it'll skip through a lot of those fundamental processes that it's really good for you to know how they work and that they exist. So I'd recommend to start off, don't use the wizard, go through and just manually do things using this interface. Okay, so step one is to create a new database. Now, I'm teaching a class called INFOST 410. So I'll call it 410 Assign 3 because this is going to be done with our third assignment for the class. So if I make a database called 410 Assign 3 and click Create, you might think you're done, but you might notice something a little bit weird. As you can notice, it attached this name, Shoal253_, to the front of my chosen database name. So why is that? I said make a database called 410 Assign 3. It decided to make it named Shoal253_410 Assign 3. Why did it put that in the front? Now, some of you probably know this. For those of you that don't, I'll give you a second to think about it. Why is that happening? And the reason is because the software cPanel is oftentimes used on shared web hosting services. Like our server right here, there's maybe another 1,000 or 2,000 other student accounts that have an account that are all sharing this same instance of MySQL. And just like a file server, with database servers, you can only have one database with one specific name. Each database name must be unique. So if you're following along and you also happen to have an account on the server, If I had first made my 410 database account and you tried to make one, it wouldn't work. You get an error message saying it already existed. So to work around this, what cPanel does is it forces any databases you create or database users that you create to have your cPanel username in front of the actual name that you choose. So my actual database name is Shoal253_410, assign 3. And that way, when you make your database, it's going to have your username appended to the front of it. So every single user account is going to have their own unique space to make a database. You're not going to have any conflicts with a name already existing. So that's a safeguard built into it. And that's important to reference and know, because if you're ever working with just the command line or you're trying to integrate this in with a web application, you need to know the full database name in order to connect to it. If you just type in 410 assign 3, it's not going to work. You have to type in the full name, which in my case is Shoal253_410 assign 3. So now that piece is done. Now, if you're just messing around with phpMyAdmin and you're not actually planning on integrating this with a web application, you don't actually have to create a privileged user account. And if you look down here, you can see this account, this database I just made, does not have any privileged users attached to it. So what is a privileged user? This is essentially a user that has some sort of permissions to interact with the database. In most cases, this is going to be a user account that can do things like create records, alter records, execute queries, insert new data, stuff like that. And this would be really useful for like an application such as WordPress, because that's going to be a front end that's going to constantly do a lot of interaction with your database. So you'd have to create a user account and grant it access to your database within cPanel. And later on in our semester, at least in my 410 class, we're going to be doing that. One of the later assignments is going to be setting up and configuring WordPress, which is a common web application. And you actually have to go through and create a privileged user and assign it to a WordPress database. But if you're just going to mess around and just use this to learn MySQL and SQL in particular, the way that it's set up currently is fine. If you want to, there's also some other things you can do in here. You can rename and delete databases. I already have a bunch in here. I've had my account for a while, so I have a lot of different stuff floating around in here. If you have a new account, I'm probably not going to see anything other than the database you may have just made. Other useful things to keep an eye out for is the size. An empty database is less than a kilobyte in size. If you have some basic table with maybe a couple of records, it's going to be a couple kilobytes in size. And this is important because generally speaking, the more complex and the larger a database is, the more overhead and operational power the server is going to need to be able to run that database. So database administrators and developers generally will try to make their databases as lightweight as possible, because the more complicated they are, the more overhead they're going to need to run, which means they need either a more expensive or faster server to run, or they may just run slower and be more sluggish, which no one likes a sluggish, slow application. So pay attention to that size. If you get a really large database, there are generally ways you can make it more efficient by restructuring how your data is stored or by moving it off of SQL to another database platform. But by default, they're really small in size. When should you worry about database size? I would say when you get over, a gigabyte in size, that's probably where. So 1 gig or larger is starting to get more into the larger realm of SQL databases. Okay, so we have our database created. Now we can actually go through and start messing around with it using phpMyAdmin. So when you click into phpMyAdmin, it's going to load the databases on the left-hand side over here. Now, if you go in here and you notice your database isn't on the left-hand side, don't panic, it'll be okay. What you can do is just close out of phpMyAdmin and then clear your browser cache. Sometimes if you launch phpMyAdmin before creating a database, and you refresh it, the cache won't update. It'll cache that database doesn't exist and the view won't be there. So you can clear your browser cache in Chrome. You can hold down Control-Shift-Delete, and that'll clear your data. So when you log back in, it'll be there. So when you click on the databases on the left-hand side, the one we just made, it's going to say no tables found. Why would that be? Well, it's that way because we just made a database that is completely empty. There isn't anything in here yet. If you were to click on a database that did have stuff on it, like down here, I have a database that's set up for WordPress. There's going to be a bunch of different stuff stored in here. These are all the tables that WordPress uses by default. So you can already see WordPress, which is a web application that is fairly common, is pretty complex. There's a lot of stuff moving in here. Now in this video, we're going to be working with a very simple database, just one table with some mock records. We're not going to talk about tables with working with multiple tables quite yet. That'll be in a later lecture. You might also notice this thing called information schema at the top. This essentially contains information about your account and what databases you have access to. So there's a lot of system information in here. Don't mess around with this database unless you know what you're doing. This is a more advanced area to poke around in, and we're definitely not going to mess with this today. So to start populating our test database, the first thing you want to do is create a table. So you click into it. It actually takes us straight to this prompt. So I'm going to make a table called users. And you'll notice when I'm entering this in, my table name is all lowercase and it's relatively short and simple in its name. I'd highly recommend keeping your names for your tables, columns, databases as short and simple as possible. Avoid using things like uppercases and special characters and regular spaces because that's going to create some issues. Number one, some platforms are case sensitive. So if you were to make a table called users with a capital U, every single time you reference this table, you would have to remember to type in the capital U. Or if you have a really long name, such as this, every single time you're typing this out in a command line interface, or if you are writing an application and integrating your database into that application, you would have to type out this long name. And I'm a human and I'm pretty bad with typos. And I know if I had to type this more than once or twice, the likelihood that I would have a typo is going to go up pretty high the longer and more complex this is. And that's going to waste a lot of my time going back through and fixing my typos and troubleshooting my code. So keep it short and simple. So now you can also specify number of columns. And I'm going to do 6 to start. Now, if you realized, oh crap, I made too many columns or not enough columns, it's okay. Any of this information can be changed later on, especially because this is a test database that's not actually going to be linked to any application. If this was for a WordPress site that was currently running and people were interacting with, you wouldn't want to go through and just change stuff on a whim because it would break the website. But because we're just learning and testing, and this is all just experimental for our own purposes, don't worry. You can go back in at any time and change stuff. So I'm going to say table name of users with 6 columns. And now we actually get to go through and start defining all these different attributes for our 6 column names. And this is where things start to get a little bit overwhelming, especially if you haven't worked with a database before, because unlike an Excel spreadsheet where you just have the column names at the top, there's a lot of other metadata or attributes you have to assign to columns when you do it within a database. And we're going to be doing this with a GUI, but keep in mind you can also create tables and databases using a command line, which can be more efficient if you know the syntax, but it's also way more complicated to do if you're just starting out on learning, which is why we're going to start with the graphical user interface for this activity. So let's go through and first off create our column names, and then we'll go and select the rest of these attributes in a minute or so. That'll be phase 2. Now for the first column name, I would recommend making this a primary key. And a primary key is essentially a unique identifier for a column within it's a unique identifier for a table within a database. So if you wanted to select one specific record, you'd be able to do that using at least one unique value. And a lot of times this is going to be an ID number. So I usually make my primary key a column named ID. And if you're working with more than one table, or if you know your database is going to have more than one table, you make this unique to this table, like user ID. So that way, if you needed to call it, if you saw the column name, user ID, you know specifically where it came from. So that way, again, you reduce the chance of there being any issues. Because this is going to be just a really simple database with just one table, I'm just going to make it ID as a starting point. And so next up, we'll create some other names. I'm envisioning this just to be a basic table to store user information. So I'm going to think about some column names that make sense for a table that would store user information. So let's go ahead and make column number 2 called email, which will be the storing email addresses and usernames. Then passwords, and I'm going to abbreviate this as just pass. Why am I calling this pass and not password? Well, because I want to keep this simple and easy. So just pass is a very nice, short, simple way to abbreviate password. Let's do fname and lname. This is going to stand for first name and last name. So why am I not doing first name? Well, because it's longer. And again, if I'm going to have to type this out in a query or to integrate with an application, it'll be easier if I can just abbreviate fname. If I wanted to do first name, that would be fine. Even first underscore name would be okay. And you're probably thinking, but Jim, you said don't use special characters. The underscore is generally the one special character that I don't really have an issue with. It's pretty common within SQL column names. But I, even though it's okay, I still just prefer without it. So I'm going to do fname and lname. Now, I would not recommend doing just name. Why is that? Because it may be unclear what type of name information is actually stored in that column. Generally, when you create columns, you want them to be as specific as possible. If you say name, a user may choose to enter in just their first name or just their last name, or maybe their full name, like Jim Schultz. Maybe it's both all in one column. So make it as specific as possible. I prefer to store data in separate columns. So that way, if you wanted to filter data based on like someone's last name, it'd be very easy to select that. Versus if you had just a name field and they were smushed together, Jim and Schultz, how would you get just the last name out of that? It'd be difficult to do. So I'd recommend breaking up your data. And then finally, in each table, in addition to having a primary key, I'd really recommend having at least one time column so this can keep track of when a record is created. I'm going to call this date. If you wanted to have more than one time or date column, you could definitely do that. So as an example, maybe you wanted to keep track of when a user account was created, when the user last logged in, when the last time this record was updated or modified. You could have 3 or 4 related date columns. You want to call them different things like reg date, log date, modified date. So you can keep track of that. You can keep track of multiple date items. I'd recommend at least having at least one column dedicated to keeping track of at least when the record was created. So that way, if you're looking at a column, looking at a set of records, you can very easily see like when a record was created. Okay, so the easy part is done, naming the columns. Now for the more complicated part, filling and defining all these other attributes. So I'm going to keep this relatively simple. For the ID column, I'd recommend keeping this int. Int stands for integer, a whole number. This column in particular for the primary key is going to be set up in a way that the primary key is automatically created and it's automatically going to be unique via some built-in MySQL database processes. And the way it's going to work is this ID number is going to be automatically generated. It's going to be a whole number, so an integer in other words. So I'm going to leave this alone. For these other column types, you have some flexibility. These are the most common column types, which is why you see them right up here in the drop-down menu first. Varchar stands for variable length character. If you are going to create a column that may have varying lengths of information, so as an example, an email address could be 10 characters long or 100 characters long. It's going to have a varying length. That's where varchar is going to be handy. If you were to select a different type of column like just char, this is going to be a fixed length. And certain types of columns will require that you set or don't set length values. Char and varchar require that you specify a length. So if I make email char and I set it to 255 characters in length, that means essentially every time a record is created, a block of 255 characters is going to be consumed in a database. Even if my email is very short. If I have a very short 10-character email, it's still going to take up all that space because it's sent to char 255. If I were to think, okay, well, I'll change this to char 10. If I had a 15-character email, what do you think might happen? Well, in that case, the first 10 characters of that email will get saved. The last 5 characters will get chopped off and deleted. So if you're going to use char, you really want to make sure this column length is longer than whatever you think the longest record is going to be inserted into this database. You want to make this extra long. And that is very inefficient because if I make this char 255 and most email addresses are 10 to 20 characters in length, it's going to be using and consuming a lot more room on the database server than what you potentially want. Now, database servers are extremely expensive. They require a lot of expensive licensing, especially if you're using something like MS SQL, Oracle, or a commercial database platform. But even if you're just using MySQL, the hardware is very expensive too. Generally, databases need very fast storage, lots of memory to quickly call records, especially from those larger complex databases. So by inefficiently using all this extra space, it's going to cost your business or your wallet a lot more money. And that's where the beauty of varchar comes in. If I set this to varchar 255 and I enter in an email that's only 10 characters long, it's not going to use all that extra space. It'll use space up to 255 characters in length. So this is dynamic. It's variable, right? So varchar is a really good record or a very good type of column to use. When would you use char? Let's say you had a column named, I don't know, like gender. You may have like a one character response. So we could do varchar, right? And you could say varchar 1. Because in a gender column, you could have M for male, F for female, O for other, right? You could have like one character responses. You're never going to have a record that is more than one character in length. Or you could have a column called like terms. Like, did the user accept terms? You might be expecting like a 0 for no, a 1 for yes, right? So like a 1 character response, or a Y or N, yes or no. You would never have more than 1 or less than 1. So you could set it to char of 1, not varchar, but char of 1. But why would you do that if there's this varchar thing available? Well, varchar requires very, very, very slightly more computing overhead. So if you have all these columns set to varchar when maybe they could have been set to char, varchar takes us this millisecond longer for the system to process. So if you have it set to varchar, and it should be potentially have been char, there's a little bit of overhead that's introduced. But honestly, unless you're running a very large website, it's not going to really make that much of a difference. But that's when you might potentially see a varchar, or sorry, see regular char, not varchar. Okay. So we'll get to that in a second. So I would recommend for email, set it to varchar and a length of 255. There are other types in here as well. So text is if you want to have like essentially a big text block. So maybe you have like a blog that you're running or a site where you're having users write comments on an article. That's where text might come in handy. Text and varchar are similar. Now the difference is certain column types require length to be specified. Not every column type requires this. So if you set this to text, you don't need to have a column length specified. Varchar does. Text does not require the length. In earlier versions of SQL, varchar had a max length of 255 characters. So if you wanted to have a text field to store long strings of text, like a long comment or like a chapter of like a book or a news article, you would have to use a text type. MySQL has evolved and this length requirement has been extended. So the text column type is a little bit less valuable. I tend to use varchar for pretty much every text column. And there are a bunch of other ones as well. A lot of these, I don't even really necessarily know what they do. If you ask me like, what is big int? How is that different from integer? I don't know. Everything is documented and you can definitely do a little bit of searching online. And we'll talk about these date and time ones later on when we get to our date column at the bottom of this. So I'll do email varchar 255, password varchar 255. And later on, we'll talk about MySQL functions and we'll talk about hashing using SHA and other types of hashing algorithms. We'll talk more about that later on. But for now, password 255, fname varchar 255, lname varchar 255, date, not varchar. For the date, I'd highly recommend for date columns, you use timestamp. So there's a couple different options in here. Timestamp will store the full time and date information. So if you create a user on August 29th at 10:13 a.m., that full record will be stamped into our table. If you select just date, what would be stored? August 29th, 2022. No time information. If you were to select just time, it would store 10:13 a.m. You wouldn't have any of the data information. But if you select timestamp, it would have both time and date. And I'd recommend this, even if you only just need or think you might need just the time or just the date. Storing all of it generally doesn't require that much overhead. And the risk is if you only store time or only store date, and then later on realize you actually need more information, there's no way to get that back. other than asking users to give that to you. So by forcing them to re-register or forcing them to provide it, it can be a mess. So I'd recommend always doing timestamp, and you can filter that data using a variety of SQL functions to only select the time or the date or everything, or format it to be a little bit more of a nicer format, like that. Timestamp, by the way, does not require a length as well. Okay, so now default. So this is going to essentially say, hey, if a user does not provide a value, do you want there to be any default? And the only one you really need to worry about in this example is timestamp. You'll say current timestamp. So if like a user says, hey, I'm going to make a new record, I forgot to provide timestamp information, what should I do? It's going to automatically insert that from the server's time and date settings, which is really helpful. The one thing to be mindful of is if you have a server that's hosted like on the other side of the planet, the time zone may be set differently. So you may be creating a record thinking it's set at your local time, but it might be at a different time. And there are ways you can double check that that'll cover in another video. Additionally, too, if the server has a time to set completely incorrectly, like maybe it's an hour and 7 minutes off for whatever reason, because no one actually configured the time on the server, the time will also be off. So you want to make sure you pay attention to this fairly regularly to make sure that your time information is getting set accurately. Now, we also have this index. And later on in the class, we'll talk more about other types of index settings. But the one for even the basic database is going to be important that you set an index of primary. This is going to tell the database server that, hey, we want this table, this column called ID, to be the primary key for this table. So the index type is going to be primary. I'm going to click OK to set the index type primary for column ID. And it's going to set it. And the last other thing I'm going to set on here is called I_A. It stands for auto increment. So whenever you create a new record, it's automatically going to increment the integer. So the first record will have the ID of 1, second record will have ID of 2, and it's going to automatically set the primary key for you. It'll be very helpful. And then that's it for this. Now there's other options you could choose to set all these other attributes. Later on, we'll be working with storage engine. There's different types of storage engines that have different types of features. So there are things you could change. But for this basic database, the rest of the stuff is okay. Click Save, and it's going to create it. So here it is. If I click Users, under this Structure tab, we're going to see all of our settings. So if you wanted to change anything down the road, just click Change, and you can modify it right in here. This is a very easy graphical user interface to use. Now that we actually have a table created, when you go back and click on your table, on your databases, it's going to default to this Browse tab. And you're going to start noticing this stuff appearing on your screen. So what do you think this might potentially be? Well, for those of you that have worked with phpMyAdmin before, you might know, hey, that is some SQL. That is that language that we're going to be learning in class. So as you're clicking around and doing things, you are going to be using the phpMyAdmin GUI to start, but it's also going to show you the actual SQL code that is used to perform that action. So select everything from the users table is the query that was just ran. So this is going to be a very, very helpful way to help teach you how to learn SQL. And right now, nothing was returned because our table is still empty. Structure will allow you to go through and change your table structure. SQL, this is the command line environment where you can actually enter in SQL commands and test your queries. And then there's other things as well. And we'll talk about these as we go through the class. Okay, so how do we actually get records into this users table? Well, there's two ways we could do it. We could use this SQL command line and do an insert statement to manually insert a user account into our table. That's more of an advanced thing that we're going to do later on. The easy way to start is going to be by using the GUI, and there's this insert tab. So on here, it's going to walk you through filling out this form to manually create records in your users table. So I'm actually going to start an email. So I'll do an email for me. And why did I start out an email and not put an ID number in? I'll let you think about that for a second. The reason is because ID is the primary key, and that's automatically set. Remember, we had said ID is the type primary, and it's gonna be auto incremented. We did that AI checkbox. So leave that alone. You could manually put a value in here if you want, but you're gonna mess up your table integrity. You wanna make sure you don't put anything in here. Let the SQL Server do its own thing. Let's do a password. And we're gonna do a clear text password for now. This is extremely insecure. Later on in class, I'll show you how to use different types of SQL functions to hash and salt passwords and do kind of more interesting, complicated, better, secure things with passwords. And then I'll put my first name, my last name, and I'm gonna leave the date column alone. If you wanted to insert a specific timestamp, you could do that, but I'll leave it to the default, which was set to current timestamp for the date column. Click go, and it's gonna insert it. So one row inserted. Again, really cool tip. As you can see, it actually generated for us that SQL insert statement that was used. So you can look at this and say, okay, I knew nothing about SQL before, but now I can sort of start to learn. I see this insert syntax. I see users, which I think is the table name. I see ID, email, pass, and say, wait a second, aren't these the column names we created for the user table? And aren't these the values we specified? So it's gonna start to make sense the more and more you poke around here and do things. So don't just disregard this stuff, but take a second and look at it. And if there are things you don't quite understand right now, that's okay. But if there's things you don't quite understand and feel like you should, then don't be afraid to Google for it. Like if you see null, you could say, okay, what does null mean? Start Googling around and try to understand what this query is doing. Again, we'll talk about the specific syntax later on in class, but if you want to work ahead a little bit and start to learn this stuff, don't be afraid to do that. So what I always like to do too is when I see this, I'm going to copy this into my clipboard, just Control C or right click copy. And if I go into users, you'll see our one record is already here. And if you wanted to change it, this is a graphical user interface. Just go ahead and make changes and you can manually save it here. And hey, what do you know? There's this update statement that shows up over here. So again, a really nice way to learn the syntax. If you wanted to do another record, go ahead and click insert, fill out this form, or if you had copied that syntax into your clipboard from before, go into SQL and let's try manually running a query. I'm just gonna modify this and start poking around. And I'm gonna change this email address out. I'll do CD Ehlers. I'll do Claire Schultz. Password of blah. And I'm just modifying the values in here. I click go. It worked. Look at that. Supposedly one row inserted. So it worked. And even though you might not quite understand what you just did here, you start to get familiar with changing values in queries and working with code and script, which I think is a really important skill set. And I can verify it's in here by clicking browse, and I now see 2 records. Now, if I try to do it again, and maybe I had an issue, like as an example, I had changed the name. Like I wanted, you know, Jim, I don't know, Johnson. And I did that. And I forgot to close off the single quote, and we'll talk more about why the single quote is needed later on in a different video. If there's an issue with your syntax, you'll number one get like a red mark right here. And if you click go, you're gonna get an error message. So if that happens, you know, try to figure out why that happened. And if you can't, for at least this point in time, it's okay. You can go back here and just do another record. So I'll do Chad Zart, who's my assistant dean. Click go. And I can go through and I can browse these records. If you were to delete a record, like let's say I were to delete Claire, and I were to make a new record, and I go back, what do you notice? Well, ID number 2 is deleted and it does not come back. So why didn't ID number 2 come back? Well, a lot of times you might choose to delete a record and then later choose to restore it. So as an example, like let's say this was a table for user information for our university. Let's say Claire worked for the university. Maybe Claire left, so we decided to delete her account. Then later she's rehired, so we decided to restore her account from a backup. Now, if we were to restore user number 2 after it was deleted, and if there was another user number 2 in here, you get an error message because the primary key would already have been taken. So once you delete a record and you create a new record, it's going to essentially assign a new ID number. Just in case you were to ever run a backup restore process, you wouldn't have to worry about any conflicts. So once the ID number is consumed, it is consumed for good. And if you make a new record, it's not going to fill in the holes. It is going to start a new number. So number 4 is there. If I delete number 4 and I do another one, I don't know, like let's do blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really matter what we put in here. You're going to see 4 is now permanently gone and 5 shows up. So again, once ID numbers are deleted, they're not going to come back. There are tools that if you were to delete a record and then restore from a backup tool like Veeam or something else, in that case, it would actually restore the ID numbers. Otherwise, they're gone for good. But again, you don't want to, you can't have a duplicate primary key. So the system really forces them to be unique. And this number will go from 1 up to essentially infinity. So you don't have to worry about column length or anything like that. Integer will store numbers as large as they go. So I think that's it for this video. I've gone for about a half hour and I try to keep these things 30 minutes or less. So that's it for now. Again, if you're one of my students, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via email. If you're just watching this on YouTube and you're a random person, feel free to leave comments down below. And if I see them, I'm happy to respond. So that's it for now, and I will talk to you later.